Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and in this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation and the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. Battle for Ugledar. This is the post of the pro-Ukrainian map service Deep State. The Russians, our armed forces, are trying to encircle the city. In recent days, the situation has significantly worsened because of the refusal to rotate the 72nd Brigade. What the Ukrainians decided to do? The Ukrainians decided to keep the core defense brigade in this area. We are talking about the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, and the Ukrainian commanders, Ukrainian South military authorities, decided to improve their positions of the 72nd Brigade by the Territory Defense Brigade that were sent from Bogoyavlenka, and the Ukrainians decided to use the Territory Defense Brigade to hold the flanks, while the 72nd Brigade should hold their lines inside of the city. But the problem is that Territory Defense Brigade is completely unmotivated forces, and when the Russians began full-scale offensive operation on the flanks, exactly the positions under the protection of Defense Brigade collapsed, and they collapsed basically automatically. So we have some geolocations, and in this video, for example, we can see Russian attack from the river of Kashlygach in the northern direction. The Russians are trying to bypass and to move through the Ukrainian defense belt and to get as close as possible to the main supply roads and to the city of Bogoyavlenka. And as you can see, based on this video, we have changed the color of map in Russian favor. As for different mappers, we have additional updates. For example, pro-Ukrainian sources and pro-neutral sources and pro-Russian sources reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to get as close as possible to the main supply road from the river of Kashlygach, and currently the Russians are in front of a stronghold, and the current distance between possible Russian edge positions and Ukrainian stronghold is less than 1.5 kilometers. And now the Russians are going to take this stronghold under control, and if the Russians are able to do this, then we can start counting minutes before Ugledar falls. Furthermore, the Russians crossed the river of Kashlygach and established complete control over the farms that located in the southwestern part of the city. Additional gains were spotted between the city of Ugledar and the coal mine and the village of Mikilskaya. So this territory was captured by the Russians as well. I'll remind you that during the offensive operation that was conducted in 2023, the Russians already established control over this residential part, but later the Russians were forced to fall back under the Ukrainian pressure. And now the Russians managed to take this territory under control once again. And the Russians managed to improve their positions in the fields between the village of Adyana and the coal mine number 1. So this is obviously significant progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation, and once again I would like to point your attention that the positions of the 72nd Brigade inside of the city hasn't collapsed, but we see that mainly the Ukrainians were defeated on their flanks, on the eastern and the western flank. And this is the situation. Most likely during this week the Ukrainians in Ugledar would be forced to fall back, and telling the truth, something tell me that by the end of this week the entire territory would be captured by the Russians, and the next Russian positions are going to lay along this red line. So everything to the south of this red line would be captured by the Russians during the upcoming week. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kurakhova direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation, and according to different sources, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly on the line between the villages of Tsukurina and Gornyak. So this information was confirmed by different mappers like neutral mappers and pro-Ukrainian mappers. So once again, as a result of clashes, the Russians take under control another stronghold, this one, and the Russians got as close as possible to the railway station and the coal mine and the telecom that located between Tsukurina and Girnik. Furthermore, the Russians moved their FPV drones focus. Now we see how the Russians are bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions, not just with FPV drones, but also with artillery. For example, in this video, we can see the results of counter-artillery duels, and as you can see, the duels ended in Russian favor. A little bit further in the southern direction, we have another landfill, another telecom, another coal mine. In this video, we can see the work of Sudoplatov crew, and as a result of FPV drone attack, the Ukrainians lost an additional communication equipment that Ukrainians were using for different purposes, and this is very important. And now this is something like the first stage of any offensive conducted by the Russians. First, they destroy some communication cameras, some different equipment. Only after that, they begin attacking the territory with drones and artillery. So we see Russians are moving. Russian FPV drone focus is moving in the southwestern direction of Gornyak, which means that most likely the Russians are going to move in the direction of Gornyak itself, and obviously during the upcoming week the changes on the ground are going to be significant. Now let's move further. There are very heavy clashes for Selidova. Basically the very heavy clashes in Selidova resumed. According to information we have, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the landfill and the coal mine to the west of Ukrainsk. This territory was captured, and this information was provided by different mappers. As for geolocations, we have additional FPV drone attacks on Ukrainian forces. Probably in this video we can see a number of attacks before the Russians managed to advance. As for Selidova itself, the Ukrainians are trying to stabilize the situation by counterattacking the Russian positions, and during the previous night, during the previous 12 hours, we received additional geolocations, additional videos of how the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russian forces, trying to slow them down as much as possible. In the final episode of the video, we can see Ukrainian armored vehicle exactly in this point, and the Ukrainians were attacking the Russians exactly in this point, which confirms positions either both of Russian forces and Ukrainians. Now let's move further in the northern direction, and starting this morning of the 23rd of September, we got a lot of updates about additional Russian progress to the north of the village of Kruta Yar, and as a result of clashes, the Russians established complete control over the village by the name of Krasny Yar. We have different reports from sources on the ground, and we have map changes according to pro-Russian sources. Neither neutral sources or pro-Ukrainian sources confirm this information, but maybe they will do this today. Now let's move further, and let's talk about Toretsk, New York agglomeration. We have just one small progress on the ground. The Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the landfill that located to the south of the prison. So this territory was captured by the Russians. Now let's move further. As for Slavyansk, it's already Slavyansk probably direction, not Siversk, not Liman. It's generally Slavyansk direction. We have very heavy clashes currently on the ground. I'll remind you that during the previous week, the Russians were focused on the territory between Makeevka and Nevska, and according to information we have, as a result of clashes for the previous week, the Russians managed to establish control first over the village of Makeevka. Then the Russians took under control Nevska, and later the Russians improved their positions between both villages. And after the Russians win this battle, we have changes on the ground, we have different confirmations. The Russians moved their focus in the southern direction, and now the Russians are handling with the salient, or with this artillery pocket between the village of Nevska and Tarskoye. I'll remind you that during the previous week we got report from pro-Ukrainian mappers that as a result of counterattack, the Ukrainians managed to restore control over these fields and to force the Russians to fall back towards Dibrova. But today the Ukrainian sources published the video how the Russians were attacking or counter-attacking in the same direction. The Russians were using significant number of armored vehicles and personnel carriers. The Ukrainians, as you can see, were trying to slow the Russians down with FPV drones, but most likely most of the vehicles managed to reach the line and to recapture lost positions. For example, one of the episodes was geolocated in this point. So summarizing everything, the Russians counter-attacked and regained lost positions. And now we understand that most likely this territory between Novosadovo, Terny, Yampolovka, Dibrova and Tarskoye is the next Russian goal in this direction. They will try to take under control this territory and basically to establish complete control over the territory that is located to the east of the river by the name of Zhiribets. So this is very important because this will allow the Russians in the future, in the very near future, to begin full-scale offensive operation towards Liman and then towards the city of Slavyansk. So this is Liman. and this is Slaviansk. Now let's move to the north in Kupiansk direction, and as you can see, we received significant number of geolocations and updates, including some of them are, let's say, unconfirmed and many confirmed updates. First of all, the sources are saying that the Ukrainians have redeployed 125th Territory Brigades to the city of Kruglyakivka with the purpose to stabilize the situation, but once again, this might be another example of a complete failure of Ukrainian military authorities, because the same situation the Ukrainians did in the vicinity of Ugledar, and the Ukrainians were completely defeated because once again the Territory Defense Brigade is completely unmotivated forces. And as you can see, the Russians are moving exactly on the positions of lowly motivated forces, and we see some changes on the ground. Let's discuss them in details. First of all, according to neutral mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly, and currently the distance between edge Russian positions and the first buildings inside of the village is less than 1.5 kilometers. According to geolocations, we have adjusted the map. For example, in this video we can see the work of Ukrainian artillery forces on the edge Russian positions in the same area, and some of the episodes were geolocated, and this is exactly the point where the Ukrainians landed their infantry with an attempt to counterattack the Russian forces, but the Ukrainians were completely defeated as a result of this counterattack and were forced to fall back. The Russians managed to hold their lines. In the southern part, we have additional videos of how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians, and this video also confirms Russian control over this territory. Some sources are saying that the next step of the armored forces of Russian Federation is to attack further in the western direction towards Kolesnikovka and Glushkovka, let's say to reach the Oskol River and then to begin moving in the southern or in the northern direction. But when talking about the southern Kupiansk direction, if we compare this operation or with, let's say, Zhelanda, Mykolаivka, Novogrodovka direction a few months ago, we can make a conclusion that most likely, based on the previous experience, most likely the Russians are going to move first of all in the southern direction towards the village of Lazova. So first of all, the Russians will try to take everything under control that lays in the southern direction, let's say between Andreevka, Lazova and the village of Peshchano, so something like this, and only after this a configuration of the front line the Russians will move further in the western direction. So something tells me that this is exactly what we are going to see during the next few months. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kursk offensive operation, the Kursk direction. We have lots of very interesting updates, and first we're going to talk about Mala Loknya. Today we received several geolocations of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces in the fields to the northeast of Mala Loknya, and this video confirms that most likely the Ukrainians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to encircle the Russians in Mala Loknya and to create a cauldron. I'll remind you that a few days ago the Russians were counterattacking, trying to slow down or to unblock the Russians inside of the cauldron, but most likely this attack was repelled. Either this attack was repelled or the Russians haven't managed to achieve the expected results. Anyway, now we understand that most likely the Russians in Mala Loknya are encircled. Now it's very difficult to understand when the Ukrainians are going to resume their offensive. We still haven't received anything from the village of Novaya Sorochna, Staraya Sorochna, Kruglenka and Mala Loknya itself, and during the next few days most likely the Ukrainians will try to take this territory under complete control. Now let's move further. Let's talk about Glushkova territory. The Ukrainians continue their offensive operation, but now the Ukrainians less active, because during the first days they suffered significant losses. Now the Ukrainians are regrouping, trying to bring additional forces, and now the Ukrainians decided to change their tactics. During the previous week they were attacking on the ground, and now the Ukrainians decided to intensify their activity of artillery and FPV drones. Now the Ukrainians are bombing and attacking the Russians' artillery positions, Russian FPV drone positions, trying to reduce their defense possibilities. So probably after 1 to 3 days of these artillery duels, the Ukrainians will launch another attempt to attack in direction of Glushkova, and the next attack is going to be much more powerful, as I understand. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.